So, good morning. You guys are so lucky. This crossing has been so easy. I've been here about 30 times, and I think this is the first time where we had we had a really easy crossing going down. We called it Drake Lake, and then to me this is easy. I'm standing here with no support and everything, so you guys nailed it on the crossings. But don't promise your friends this. Don't go, it's no problem. It's a greatly exaggerated. You just are lucky. Speaking of lucky, oh my God, you want to guess how many whales we saw yesterday? Over 100 fin whales. That's good for your social media. We've had 2 independent counts on that. And remember, those guys were big. They're 85 feet long. That's whatever that is, 20-something meters long. Second largest creatures on Earth. So, and then, of course, we saw hundreds and hundreds of porpoising penguins. So anyway, as I said before, I hope you got your penguin experience, and I hope I know you came for the penguins, but I hope you come back for the ice, yes. But today's not about ice. Today's about where you have been at the beginning of the trip and where we're going back to, right? And so I thought it was important to talk about South America because only part of the trip was Antarctica, and now we had such a perfect experience in Antarctica. Oh, okay. They're working on the lights. Okay, so this is our journey. We're about where the right-hand arrow is underneath the word Stanley. We're about the same latitude as Cape Horn. So South America is now off on our left side, right, our port side, if you look at a map in your stateroom. Right, so I'm switching back to geology. And it's important to know that geology is not geography, okay? And geology is the study of what's happening under the earth in 3 and 4 dimensions. And every rock has a story, but I always say 3 stories. How the original rock was formed, how it was deformed into rock. I'll mention the different kinds of rocks and the mountain ranges, and then how it's eroded. So I won't go into that for every rock, but just so you know, every rock tells 3 stories. And the other thing that I like to stress to my students and guests and friends and family till they're bored silly is geology controls everything. It's the bedrock of all knowledge in nature. And you got to know the geology because the mountain ranges determine how species are separated, how languages and cultures around the world are separated. And the ocean basins separate cultures and species. And the reason why we have different species in South America from Australia, it's all about geology. So every biologist appreciates geology, and because it sets the stage for this evolution. Okay, so we're going to talk about South America, okay? And you've seen South America your whole life. You're familiar with the shape, and you notice, unlike Asia or Africa, the mountains are on the left side. So it's very similar to North America. And it's all due to plate tectonics. And I talked about plate tectonics before, but because plate tectonics is the overall theory, theme, etc. of geology, we have to go into that. But before I go into the details, let me give you a sense of what geography is. So don't confuse the two, okay? And geography is about where things are. And one of my favorite things is for us to understand how big these continents are, such as Africa and Antarctica. Remember we said Antarctica was the size of United States plus 2 Alaskas? Well, here you get the idea. I just picked Brazil and Argentina. And we have a lot of people from Europe, so I added a slide to show the size to famous and well-known European countries. And I didn't do it for the Argentinians and the Brazilians because they know how big it is. They grew up here. So anyway, it gives you a sense, a scale of what we're talking about here. Okay, and we already talked about this, so I don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but the continents are constantly moving around at about 1 inch a year, about 2.5, 3 centimeters a year. And they're moving around like bumper cars or or mahjong blocks or dominoes or whatever you want to call it. And they come together occasionally and they split apart occasionally. And the one you're most familiar with that we've already talked about is Pangea, when they just by randomness happened to be all together about 200 million years ago. They've been moving ever since. We know what speed they are going. I think I mentioned before that they're going different speeds. India's going really, really fast. It's going north. But what I'm concentrating today is on South America. It's doing the same thing North America does, which it's moving west at about the average 1 inch a year. So it's not fast, it's not slow. It's just the average, 2 or 3 centimeters a year. Of interest for earthquakes is Africa is moving north, slamming into Europe, and Australia is moving north, and its front edge is New Guinea, plowing into Indonesia. And I mentioned this before, but this is definitely worth review. This is like the most important cross-section in any geology course, and this shows how everything's moving. Every single piece of the earth is moving. Nothing is still. The core is not still. The mantle's not still. The crust isn't still. Everything's moving. That's the most important thing I want to get a point here. Everything is moving about the same speed, that order of, and what part of your body goes at speed? Your fingernail growing, right? Not your fingernail scratching, your fingernail growing, okay? And it's solid, it's not liquid. Just because we color it red doesn't mean it's liquid. It's all solid. Think of Play-Doh or bread dough or something like that. It flows. After last 2 days, we got to compare it to ice. Ice flows. It's a solid and it flows. The same idea here. It's under pressure, whether you're talking about ice or the earth, it's under pressure from the weight of everything above it. So that's what allows it to flow. And I'm going to talk about each one of these plate boundaries in order. So you could see the plates come apart in the middle of each ocean, or in the Pacific. It's on the edge. I'll show you that. And they come together, and particularly in the Pacific, spectacular subduction zones. It's labeled over here, but it's this whole feature here, like on a 3D map here and a cross-section here. And we'll mention the yellow magma coming up. All right, there's 3 kinds of plate boundaries. I think I mentioned this before. And that is the plates. There's about a dozen of these plates on the Earth. And think of them as egg shells on top of a hard-boiled egg. Imagine you break the egg into like 12 pieces, or let's say 10, because you only have 10 fingers, and you start moving the plates around with each finger. That's what's going on. Some of the plates are going to come apart, some are going to go together, and some are going to slide past each other, as you can see in this very simplified diagram. And the first thing I want to talk about is divergent plate boundaries, because they are what creates all 3 or 4 of our great oceans. At the plate boundaries where they're pulling apart, the divergent plate ground, we also call it seafloor spreading, because it almost always happens under the ocean, like 3 miles, 5 kilometers deep. And what's happening here is the plates are pulling apart, and it forms melting. It creates a melting here, and so you get some basalt volcanism there. And so this is found under each of the oceans. Even part of the Southern Ocean has this. And these plates are pulling apart at what speed? Depending on your system, either 2 or 3 centimeters or 1 inch a year. So each one's going apart. And they have this ridge system that goes down the middle, and it's really obvious. And here's a cool trivia. We didn't know it existed till the 1950s when radar got good enough and to detect it. And when they discovered it, it's like, oh my God. And every ocean has this feature. No other planet has this. And so that got geologists all excited and started working all around the world, and that eventually led to the discovery of plate tectonics. It was this mid-oceanic ridge was the tip-off that something was happening in Earth that wasn't happening in any other planet. And you could see this in Iceland. Has anybody here been to Iceland? Oh my gosh, half. Wow. That's great. Yeah, Iceland is the Yellowstone of Europe. And it's really an amazing thing. And there's cruises that go there, just, and I guess I'm going there in September, and I love it there. It's amazing. It's had a lot of eruptions lately, in the last 2 years. It has had eruption right by the capital city. Can you imagine that luck? So, all right, and so, yes, the Pacific has this going on, but it's on the eastern side, so we don't call it the mid-Pacific Ridge. We call it the East Pacific Ridge or Rise. It's the same idea. But this is the one you've probably never heard of because it doesn't have Iceland, number one, and it's not near United States, number two, and it doesn't create big earthquakes that kill people. But it's out there, and it's very, very important for South American geology. And the reason why it's important all around the world is this what creates the ocean basins. And we're talking all of them. The Atlantic Ocean, the Arctic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, they're all formed this way. And the Atlantic, Arctic, and Indian Ocean are newbies. They've created since Pangaea spread apart. And what happens is, it takes tens of millions of years for it to do this. And this is happening now, right up here. This one up here is happening in East Africa. East Africa is splitting apart and becoming a new continent. We have to give it a name. And it's a new plate. So whenever you hear a rift valley, and there's failed rift valleys like the Rio Grande Valley and the Amazon and the Mississippi, they don't always succeed. But if they win, if they succeed, they rip the continent apart, and you end up with a sea. A long, skinny sea, such as the Red Sea is the most famous one, and you've seen that on the map, and but also the Gulf of California in Mexico. These are long, brand new seas, only like 5-10 million years old. Yes, that's new for a geologist. Okay, 5 or 10 million years. And eventually they'll widen out to form the Atlantic. So without plate tectonics, you can't have ocean basins, and without ocean basins, we don't have, these separations. We don't have cruises. Yeah. So, okay, so animations are always cool, right? So this is the splitting apart of Pangaea, and the time is in the upper right, if you are taking notes. No, just kidding. And it's really a good thing there. This is taught in all the elementary schools and high schools around the world, so it's a good thing. And you can see South America, and I use animations that show South America, and South America's on the lower left. Okay? So remember, it didn't happen that fast. It's taken 200 million years to happen. Okay, and I mentioned this. This is cool. I've been talking to a lot of you, and speaking of that, I have a unfinished conversation with several of you. One is Callie. You need to talk to me again. And Peggy, I haven't finished. You get busy, and I can't finish my conversation. So if you're in the audience, I need to finish my conversation with you. And anybody else, I just particularly remember those two conversations were interrupted. So Pangaea is just the one you're most familiar with. But as I mentioned before, that you have all these bumper cars going on, boom, 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 and they did get together earlier in the Earth's history. And I decided to name the one 2 Pangaeas ago because so many people asked me about it. We actually have one from 3 Pangaeas ago. And so that's pretty cool. And so we putting this together, and this is the state of the art of geology. See, it's a lot more than just geography, which is where things are now. We're trying to put this together for the last 4 billion years. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and we've had remnants of rocks for about 4 billion years. And we're piecing it all together. It's a big 4-dimensional puzzle. And you can go online. These images are all available. They're free of charge, or you can buy a used geology book for $4 on Amazon. So it's a really good thing to know about. And you could skip the whole chapter on chemistry and get to the plate tectonics. So, Okay, so I was talking to someone about this in the hallway yesterday, and I thought, I'm going to add a slide about this. And we know where all the continents are going, and we know where they're all going to pile up. Not all of them. Antarctica's going to stay down there because it's surrounded by rift valleys, but the rest are all going to head toward Hawaii and have a vacation together. Yeah. And they're all going to collide together in the western, somewhere between Tahiti and Hawaii, where they are now. And it's going to be a mess. Lots of big mountains. And the Himalayas will no longer be big. The biggest mountain range will be in the middle of the Pacific, where they all come together. The new Himalayas will be not where they are now. Okay, so that was Divergent. Now I'm going to talk about the transform plate boundaries. And this is the one that people know the least about, but they're really important in history and where people live. So we should learn about it. It's where they go past each other, but they don't slide past each other. There's no lubrication or ball bearings between these plates. These plates are like 60 miles deep, 100 kilometers deep. And they hold together, and the pressure builds up for hundreds of years, and then suddenly, bang, they move. And, of course, that's the earthquake. And they don't even break in one area. They break on one, and that sparks the next, and sparks the next. And so there's a whole series of, like, micro earthquakes. But it all happens within a minute, so we call it one earthquake. And where these transform plate boundaries are, and they're caused by, is they usually connect two rift valleys or two divergent plate boundaries. And so there's hundreds and hundreds of these on the seafloor, but we don't care about them. Nobody lives down there, and the earthquakes aren't that big, and they do not create tsunamis. Why? Because the plates are sliding past each other, and they don't lift up the seafloor. So these don't create tsunamis. They tend not to kill people, unless they're on land. Okay, and we have 2 or 3 of these really famous ones, and some that are not so famous. There's one that goes through New Zealand, right through the capital city. There's one that goes through right by Israel, and a lot of you've heard of Israel, right? Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, they're all on this fault. And then, of course, we have the one that's been in a lot of Hollywood movies, and that's in California, probably the most famous fault in the world. Whose fault is it? San Andreas, yeah. And in California, it has 3 sections. The upper part moved in 1906 and killed 3,000 people. The middle part keeps moving continually, and the lower part hasn't moved since 1857. So that's what Los Angeles is waiting for, the big one. And yes, they're getting prepared. All right, so Hollywood really likes to do that. The reality is, yes, we do have earthquakes in California. As you may remember, I live in Los Angeles County, and we have earthquakes, but the earthquakes are only kill like about 50 people every half century. That's about 1 a year. Compare that to like auto accidents and other things that kill people. It's not that bad. So people ask me all the time, how can you live in California with earthquakes? I'm like, it only kills like 1% a year. How can you live in any other city with the automobiles? That kills a lot more. That kills 35,000 Americans a year, and probably about a similar number in Europe. All right, so Hollywood, anybody see a Hollywood movie where they show the Golden Gate Bridge being destroyed or California falling in the ocean? It ain't gonna happen, no matter how much people want it to. It's not gonna. All right, especially people in Texas, right? Yeah, they got population envy in Texas, and so it's not going to happen because it's continental crust, and continental crust floats on the mantle. It cannot sink, and I'll talk about that later. Okay, we are going over a transform plate boundary right now, and I thought, wow, what good timing for this talk, and because we're east of Cape Horn. So do you know which the transform plate boundaries are shown in light green, lime green? So which one do you think? The upper one or the lower one? Upper one, right. So here's Cape Horn, and we're right here. We're going north across between right about there. Isn't that cool? To be over transform plate boundaries when on the very time that you hear about them. And I'm going to come back and talk about this little, what I call a nanoplate. This is a microplate. There's about 12 big plates, and then there's microplates, and this is one of the smallest plates in the world. But we'll come back to that. And so why am I, oh no, I'm going to talk about it now. And that is because we were just at Elephant Island yesterday, where we saw how many whales? Over 100. That's the minimum number, okay? I've heard numbers much higher. So Elephant Island is not just important for wildlife and super important for history, but it's also really good trivia. It's at the intersection of 3 plates. And so you have some uplifts. So all those beautiful islands we saw some at sunrise and some at Elephant Island, then some in the fog when we were looking at, distracted by 100 whales. We saw many islands out there. And you could see what's happening there. It's bumper cars, right? Remember the light green one, they're sliding past each other, and the red ones are pulling apart, and the blue ones are coming together, so it's crazy out there, and that's why that land is uplifted. Someone asked me if it was part of the Andes, and it really isn't. It's its own rocks, and which I'm going to talk about later on. It's not part of the Andes. It's unique, not unique, but it's formed right there. The part that was the Andes is down in the Antarctic Peninsula, shown in tan at the bottom of the diagram. Okay, are earthquakes important? Yes, I put this slide in not to depress you or anything, but to let you know how topical there is. About every year there's a major earthquake in the world, big 8.0 kind of thing, and about every 5 years, on average, there's a big killer that kills about 20,000 people. This one was much worse. This is the worst one we've had since Haiti. Haiti was like 300,000 got killed. So about every decade we have a really big killer. We know how to build buildings. If you want to talk about that in the next few days, I'd love to talk about that. That's not what my talk's on though. And that we have the places that are modern, places with no corruption, like Japan and California, know how to build buildings that do not collapse in earthquakes, even though Hollywood keeps wanting to knock them down. Where that was happening is, as you see on the upper diagram, those are the epicenters of all the quakes, including the big one. And then the lower diagram, it shows all the faults. Turkey is the 4th major transform fault. I mentioned the Middle East and I mentioned New Zealand, but Turkey has one just like the San Andreas Fault, and it goes right by Istanbul, one of the largest cities on Earth. And lucky for us, the big earthquake did not happen on that fault, which is shown in yellow. It happened on the one down there in the purple on the bottom. And what it is basically all of Arabia, not just Saudi Arabia, but the whole Israel, Arabia, area. That's a microplate, and it's shoving into Asia. It doesn't happen all the time. Remember, there's no lubrication. This happens. The pressure stores up maybe once a century, and whoosh, and that's what happened. Okay, I have a question for you. Every time you see South America, do you get hungry? I do. Every time I see someone walking around with an ice cream, I always think of this. I said, oh, they're eating Brazil. Oh, my God. Or Peru's falling off. Lick it. Something like that. But you got to hold on to Argentina, right? So, yeah. And you know how they're cold. So what's my next joke? The left side of an ice cream cone is Chile. You guys must be a morning talk. At least I don't have penguins walking down the aisle with cell phones on this one. So, all right, so now we're going to talk about the big bad one. This is the one, the reason I moved 30,000 miles out west on a Greyhound bus to go to grad school was because of convergent plate boundaries. I love these things. We have the biggest volcanoes, the biggest tsunamis, the biggest earthquakes. This is where geology is on steroids, or the drug of your choice, whatever. All right, so convergent boundaries are, the top diagram shows an oceanic crust on the left, diving underneath a continental crust. So that's oceanic crust over here, diving underneath, and it goes down at about 30, 40, 50 degree angle. And when it gets down, and remember, it doesn't slide, there's no lubrication, it jerks down about every 100 years, 200 years, and so we have big earthquakes there. But when it gets down to about 100 miles deep, that's about 180 kilometers deep, it creates melting, which you see there in the yellow, and that represents magma. And magma is fluid, and it's hot, so it rises up to form the volcanoes. This can happen when you have oceanic crust going under oceanic crust, as you see there on the bottom diagram. But that's the story on the other side of the Pacific, Japan and Philippines. So the story here for South America is up here, and it actually creates bigger earthquakes. Okay, so you've probably never seen a view of the world this way, because it's sort of boring. It's all Pacific Ocean. But this is South America is on the right here, tan, and the oceanic ridge is in the middle. And this is what's been going on for the last 100 million years. And as it pushes in, you notice South America is moving west, and the dark blue is disappearing underneath. That's oceanic crust. It disappears. Where does it go? It goes down, and that's that word subduction. Okay, so I'll just show that one more time. So, because some people like maps better than cross sections. So look at the dark blue approaching South America on the right, and you can see the dark blue area, which is the older crust, oceanic crust, disappearing underneath. And this is that same speed, about 1 inch a year, about 1.5 centimeters. This is what it looks like on a still map. But I think the animation is a better way of seeing it. So a still map allows me to put more notes on it. Okay, so you can see the two plates are coming together. The oceanic crust, which is shown in pink and blue over here, is going underneath South America, which again is shown in tan. The subduction zone itself is shown in dark blue, and I really like it because they show shark teeth. It's a symbol that someone had a really good sense of humor like 60 years ago. They said, what kind of symbol should we use for shark teeth? And the other guy goes, well, the movie Jaws is out, and I remember the Jaws swallowing that guy, and so they came up with shark teeth. I think it's really cool. It's easy to remember. Think of a big shark swallowing a Hollywood actor. Okay, this is that same cross section again, just a little blown up a little better. And the important things, there's 3 things I'm going to be talking about. And one is the trench here, and that's where tsunamis come from. One is the magma rising, and that's where the volcanoes come from. And the other is this one plate going underneath, each one going about 1 inch, 2-3 centimeters a year, and that's what causes the earthquakes. They're each formed in a different part of that diagram. The Andes are the main feature, right? In South America, the main mountain range. How many people here knew it was the longest mountain range in the world? Yeah, it's also the straightest. It's really an amazing feature. And it's not that old. It's only been around for, 60 million years. The southern part, the Patagonian part we saw, has only been around for 20 million years. And I know a lot of you went on excursions, and you learned that the Patagonian desert has only been in existence for 20 million years because the Andes weren't there, and the range used to come through. So there again, as I said, geology affects everything. It also affects where we find deserts. It's not just languages and species, but where we find deserts, where we find rainforests. It's due to this bedrock geology. Okay, this is some volcanoes in the bottom diagram taken from airplane this year, and the regular folded mountains in the upper diagram. All right, so speaking of the trenches, the deepest trench in the world trenches are over there where there's no land, over by Guam, and there's a subduction zone off of Guam. But the deepest trench off of any continent is here in South America. It's off of Chile and Peru. And one reason is Peru, Chile, right on the border there, is the driest place in the world. It hasn't never rained in 500 years. Okay, so they don't have any rivers, and the rivers don't bring mud down to fill up the trenches. So the trenches are pristine. I call it clean, and so they're very deep off of Peru, Chile, the dry part of Peru, Chile. In fact, here's good trivia. From the trench off of Peru, Chile, all the way up to the tall mountains is the greatest topographic relief in the world. It's not the Himalayas, from like India up to the top of Mount Everest. It's from the bottom of this trench up to the top of the Andes. Isn't that cool? I think if you're Argentinian, you should be proud of that, because the highest peak is Aconcagua, which is in Argentina. Yeah, there we are. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yay for Argentina. So, speaking of yay, a little commercial break here. I want to thank all the people. Of course, we have Elizabeth, our high energy director here, but also the lights people. Kim, let's give him applause. And in particular, I already said this over the loudspeaker, but I couldn't see anybody. I want to thank our awesome translators. We have Yuri from Brazil and Karen from Mexico. Yeah, my new best friends on board the ship. They're great. They have great stories too. If you see them at the front desk, and they have awesome stories. Okay, so you've all heard of the Ring of Fire, right? It's wrong. It's not a ring. It's a horseshoe. Okay, and it's not fire. It's lava. Okay, I mean, or mostly ash. So, or earthquakes. Anything but fire, right? It's not fire. Okay, but so. Johnny Cash made a song about it, so he can't change the lyrics. So, but it's sort of a ring. I call it a horseshoe of lava, though. Okay, so it's caused by subduction zones. This whole 15-minute part of the talk, as I said, is my favorite part of geology. I love it. And we have subduction zones. These create the most beautiful volcanoes on Earth. I went to grad school in Oregon, and the Pacific Northwest has beautiful volcanoes, but this talk is about South America. So they have beautiful mountains. They have gorgeous, the prettiest one in the Northwest is Cotopaxi outside of Quito, and they have other ones in Peru, and Chile has some of the prettiest volcanoes on Earth. They're not very famous for Europeans and North Americans to visit, but I really encourage you, next time you come back, go out to Patagonia, see both sides of the border. You can even drive across the border, you can take a boat across the border, all sorts of things, but try to see the volcanoes in central Chile. They're really beautiful. Okay, and this is where they line up. You can see most of them are in which country? Chile. All right, Colombia has a few and had the worst disaster of all. 20,000 people died when I was younger. I think I was in high school when that happened. But the most of them are down here in Chile, and so they are worth seeing. They're all beautiful in their own way. They're so tall. These kind of volcanoes that we find around subduction zones are what we call composite volcanoes. They're really, really tall, so they tend to have snow on them, even at the equator. So they're the beautiful ones that you see, like Mount Fuji and Mount Rainier. So here's one of the most important diagrams. I have a poster of this in the classroom because it, to me, sums up all the geology in one diagram. The bottom diagram are the plate boundaries, done in color to make it easier. You can see there's about a dozen of them that are big. There's 7 big ones and about a dozen ones worth memorizing in a class. But we're at the top diagram is earthquakes. What do you see? The pattern, earthquakes happen on the edges of plates, and that's probably the most important thing to know if you're into modern humanity, because of the major earthquakes that have happened this year and will happen in the future in places like California. And these are the greatest earthquakes that have happened in the last, let's say, in my lifetime. Leave it at that. Okay, and so you have famous ones like the Japan one with the famous tsunami, and you have the Indonesia one with an even bigger tsunami. But I'm going to mention this one on the bottom. The biggest quake of all in my lifetime was where? Chile. Yeah. So it not only has the most volcanoes, it also has the biggest earthquakes in South America. So here's just a sample of one earthquake. This is the biggest one ever recorded. It was probably because a bigger section ripped open. I told you the quakes occur and they just keep going down. It's like a chain of atomic bombs going off. Boom, 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 boom. In Chile, a whole bunch. It was like equivalent to like 1,000 atomic bombs in a row. And it was very destructive. Fortunately, it wasn't as populated as it now, but 600 miles, 1,000 kilometers moved. And that was only matched by the Indonesia quake. This is what a tsunami from Chile would look like, and the colors represent the height, but also the time, and they're really related. The height of a wave and the time it takes, they're related because it's energy. It's the same as light energy or sound energy. It goes out as it goes out, and tsunamis go the speed of airplanes. So it's really cool. If you were to fly out of Chile, you would know exactly how many hours it would get to, let's say, Hawaii. And it's the same answer. Tsunamis and jet airplanes go the same speed. Okay, so wrapping up the geology part here, the South America is really two sections. You've seen this your whole life. You've got the Andes on the left, that longest mountain range on Earth, the second tallest mountain range on Earth, and it has a lot of volcanoes, as we saw, lots of collision going on. And then the east side is we mostly just call Brazil, but you could say Brazil, Uruguay, and northern Argentina, where we're going to in a few days. And this is stable, and so it's very comparable to the United States, where the stable parts, Canada and eastern United States, no earthquakes, no volcanoes, no tsunamis, and we got all the mountains on the west. In Europe, it's more complicated. You have the north is stable, up by a lot of Brits here, and Germans and Norwegians. That's the stable part, and it's the southern Europe that is the east-west, that is the mountains. So we got comparisons in every continent here. So I'm just going to go through some of the rocks. Sedimentary rocks are flat. They're sedimentary, made out of sediments, right? So things like sandstone. And that's what the Falkland Islands are made out of. And other famous places in the world, you know, like Grand Canyon. So those are sedimentary rocks. All right, they're famous for fossils, like I mentioned for Antarctica. We can't have fossils without sedimentary rocks, because they have to be deposited in sediments, you know, things like particularly mud. Then we had metamorphic rocks, which I mentioned over the loudspeaker in the last 2 days. And these are rocks that are caused by squishing and smushing at these collision zones. So the Andes, like we saw in Tierra del Fuego, and yesterday at Elephant Island. So Patagonia, every mountain you saw near after we left Punta Arenas, and that evening we saw beautiful mountains, and then that morning coming into Ushuaia, and then we went on our excursions, and all those mountains are all metamorphic rocks, southern tip of the Andes. Elephant Island is more complicated. I told you I'd get back to this. It's at the intersection of 3 plates, and it's the sediments that are squished at a subduction zone. It's not part of the continental crust. So it's subduction zone, and it's really interesting. They're created right there. And the rocks, this is what it looks like, a geology map on detail of Elephant Island looked like. We saw just glaciers, and well, you guys were looking at whales, but I was looking at the glaciers and the rocks. And but a geologist would map the actual kind of rocks. And the perfect equivalent to this is the California coast. In fact, Catalina Island looks just like this geologically. And that's in my backyard, so I know the rocks there really well. And so anyway, just a little trivia. Igneous rocks you're probably more familiar with, but I want to mention the most common igneous rock on land is andesite. And what do you think it's named after? The Andes, yeah, it's really cool. We actually have a super common rock. We find it in Mount Rainier and Mount Fuji, but it's named after the Andes because there's so many volcanoes here. Okay, they also have granite, and I mentioned basalt a lot because that's what a lot of the lava that we saw, features that we saw in the South Shetland Islands are almost all basalt, and that included the Deception Island and the other islands that were under ice, like Livingston Island and King George Island. Those were almost all basalt. So here's some pictures of those places you're familiar with. We've already mentioned this many, many times. Even Tori mentioned this during our recap, and that is the red is from cinder cones, the yellow is from ash layers, and the black is basalt. So you've seen a lot of volcanic rocks in your slides. You'll see them in the background, especially when there's no whales distracting you. So like at Deception Island, you'll see a lot of the red, yellow, and black colors. And of course the white snow in that little sailboat for scale. So I paid a lot of money for that sailboat to be there, just so you know. Okay, just a few concluding remarks here. Where we're approaching here as we cross the tectonic plate, the transform plate, we're now entering one of the widest shelves in the world. And a continental shelf is the extension of every continent that is continental crust, and it's really shallow. It's only a few hundred feet or a few hundred meters deep. You can actually build bridges and oil platforms on these shelves. Look at the shelf there. It goes all the way out to the Falkland Islands, Malvinas Islands. That is one of the widest shelves in the world. Do they have oil? Probably. Most continental shelves have oil underneath it. So you may have heard the term Patagonia. Patagonia refers to basically the southern part of the ice cream cone. You know, that part of the ice cream cone you don't eat, or maybe you throw it away, or maybe you just scarf it down. So the part of the ice cream cone you hold is Patagonia. And it refers to everything. So anyway, and you may have heard of Patagonia Corporation was just given to charity. The whole corporation was. So I thought it was okay to put their name up because they're a nonprofit organization now. And then I want to end with something different because it's newsworthy. I always like to add news to my talks, whether it's in class or whether it's guests like you. And that is, we've been to Antarctica. We had a phenomenal experience. You had a nice, beautiful sunny day, one of the best days I've ever experienced in South America, and with all those beautiful glaciers and everything. Then you had the stunning wilderness experience yesterday with all those whales and porpoising penguins. But we don't want you to forget the story that's in today's news. Several people texted this to me, didn't even know I was giving a talk today. Said, "Did you see the news?" Okay, so this was in BBC and CNN and New York Times and everything. And it's a chart I didn't include, so I thought I'd throw in the chart. But this is the amount of sea ice. I think you saw the quote that I gave ABC News a couple years ago, which is it was a 41% decrease in sea ice. That was 2 years ago. And only in the peninsula. I got to add on the peninsula, not in Antarctica. Okay, so, but this is a chart all over the news. In fact, you can see it on your TV on BBC News and whatever else is on TV. And so it's something, as I said before, when you go home, you're ambassadors of the knowledge. You can tell them about our awesome whales. I bet you no one's ever heard of a fin whale of your friends, right? And now you can tell them. 85 feet long, they're different colors on the right and left. We don't know everything about them. They eat little tiny krill the size of your little finger. But you can tell them about the geology. You know, there's a volcano there the size of the shape of a donut, you know, with a bite taken out of it. And but something else you can also add is the idea that the proof is that the ice is decreasing. Things are changing here. And you've heard from Tori talking about how it's changing penguin species here. And so it's all a package when you're part of that privileged 170,000 people that get to come to Antarctica. Part of the package is the beauty, the photography, the wildlife, but also the knowledge. So thank you for being such a great audience.